Um, Thank you. We just sent we are recording this. This is a really important series. This is a series for us to learn. This is a series for us to then say, what do we do as individuals and as community? And I feel really privileged and honored to welcome Ty Gregory. Ty, the JCRC has been such an important part of Beth Jacob, and we have been really active participants in the wonderful work that's going on. I don't know that everyone knows Ty's background, so I want to share with you what was on the website. Ty joined the JCRC as its 5th executive director in April of 2020. He was previously executive director of A Wider Bridge, AWB, a New York-based partner organization of JCRC, working to advance LGBTQ equality and inclusion in Israel. And during his 6 years as deputy director and later executive director of AWB, the organization grew from a Bay Area startup to a leading voice for Jewish and Israel inclusion in the fabric of LGBTQ and progressive America. Before AWB, Ty spent several years working for APAC in San Francisco. He's a graduate of UC Davis and a native of San Diego. And for those of you who don't know what JCRC does, it's a public affairs organization. It works on behalf of the Bay Area Jewish community. It represents synagogues, Jewish organizations on critical issues affecting Jews as individuals and as a community. It creates consensus and it leads advocacy efforts in the organized Jewish community, ensuring that our voices are amplified and heard. JCRC builds bridges with other faith, interest, and ethnic-based groups that share our passion for social justice, forging relationships based on the issues that our community cares about most. You should know that JCRC is one of 125 JCRCs around the country, and together these JCRCs form the grassroots national umbrella organization, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. I so appreciate the justice the JCRC fights for, the advocacy the JCRC fights for, and the creation of alliances and partnerships. Ty, you guys do such great work. Thank you so much. And you're doing really important work on anti-Semitism on lots of levels. And if we can learn from you about kind of a community connectedness, community-based activism for tonight, that would be really wonderful. So welcome and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Rabbi. Thanks for your standing partnership with us and the congregation's work on the issues that we care about. You've been a friend of JCRC long before I came on the scene, and really appreciate this opportunity to join you and the community to talk about this issue. So before I dive in, I want to frame how we're going to do it this evening. I'm going to go through a deck, and there's really going to be 3 parts to it. Number 1, understanding the current environment around anti-Semitism. Number 2, I'm going to walk you through the brand new anti-Semitism consensus statement that 50 organizations, including yours, had a role in crafting for the Bay Area that JCRC is using across the Bay Area. And third, how we're going to address this problem and what roles you can play to help us move the ball forward individually and as a community and as a congregation. So I would encourage you to think about how you see your story in all of this. So with that, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to, give me just a moment. Okay, can you see that? Okay, great. So the way I want to frame what we're seeing today is through 5 buckets. 1, government and politics, elected officials, government office holders, the Democratic Party. 2, NGOs, non-government organizations. These are faith organizations. These are ethnic communities. Black Lives Matter, the Black community, Latino organizations, LGBT organizations, as the rabbi noted from my background. This is an education. So school boards and organizations that deal with public education, higher ed. Some of you are familiar with the ethnic studies fight. Corporate life, this is really about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the call for these efforts across corporate America, though certainly we're seeing these in some of these other buckets as well, DEI efforts, including in our own Jewish community. And lastly is our own bucket. So let me give an example of where we've seen some trend lines in each of these buckets to do some framing. Number one, government and politics. Last May, we see the Gaza escalation. The rockets are firing. Iron Dome is in action. Halfway across the world, ripple effects. We see all these terrible anti-Israel resolutions in local Democratic parties. Actually, just 30 minutes ago, I was helping navigate with my colleagues an anti-Israel resolution that came up at the local Alameda County Democratic Party. Now, we're not here to talk specifically about Israel, but let me tell you, there's a lot of passages in that resolution that cross the line into anti-Semitism. And many of the people introducing it are blissfully unaware of what those lines are, right? We saw this at the San Francisco Democratic Party. We saw it in the Santa Clara Democratic Party. Thankfully, we haven't seen it in San Mateo since May, but we must be vigilant. There's a hint for later. Giving you an example in the NGO space. We all know about the Women's March and the issues there. We all know about Black Lives Matter and the issues there. What we're seeing is a separation between Jews and the classic partners we've had in various justice movements because of Israel. We've also seen a heightened challenge in explaining to our natural longstanding partners, anti-Semitism isn't just tiki torches and white hoods. Anti-Semitism is systemic. You can find it all across the political spectrum. There's casual anti-Semitism. So we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism with many of our ethnic partners. And of course, you know, just a few weeks ago, the National Presbyterian Church had a BDS resolution that crossed the line in singling out Israel in a way that many of us perceive to be anti-Semitic. In education, many of you have been following the ethnic studies battle, in which anti-Semitic rap lyrics first appeared in the ethnic studies model curriculum. And even after we removed that, many of the partners in education didn't understand why Jews felt like they belonged in ethnic studies, reducing us to a white religious minority, rather than recognizing the true breadth and depth of how Jews identify as a people, a culture, a religion, traditions, a nation, a people. In corporate life, after the Gaza escalation in May, almost every day, I received an email or a phone call from an employee or a DEI consultant or an HR professional saying, help. The conversation in my corporate space is becoming so toxic. I'm hearing from my Jewish employees, or from the Jewish employees' perspective, I'm not hearing from my HR department, or I'm not hearing from my DEI consultants anything about Jewish identity, or the conflict has taken over our Slack channels, the way we communicate in our corporations, and Jews are being canceled unless they disavow the state of Israel. And within our own community, we've seen conversations emerge because of the trends in these other four buckets around what is anti-Semitism? Let's put forward this thing called the IHRA definition. Let's put this thing forward called the Nexus definition, the Jerusalem definition. And now we have all these competing definitions that are out in the world. Well, guess what? We're one community. We have to figure out how to move together. We can't be divided inside of our own communities if we're going to be effective with this. So we also see a challenge inside the Jewish community in that we're not necessarily all aligned or clear on what constitutes anti-Semitism, where we identify anti-Semitism, and how to grapple with it. And so it's that last bucket that we're going to tackle first and spend a little extra time on, because that's us, right? And we need to build the capacity in our own community to have these conversations. So over the past 18 months, JCRC worked on an anti-Semitism consensus statement. This is something that we do whenever there's a hot button issue that we need to understand how the community is landing for us to be able to advocate, to meet with Nancy Pelosi or Jackie Spear, to go into a superintendent's office and say, this is how the Jewish community feels on an issue, and to confidently claim that we represent the feelings of most Jews in the Bay Area. So we went through this consensus process on anti-Semitism, recognizing there are dueling definitions of anti-Semitism, and recognizing that our community needs to come together to address it. So with that, we developed and passed an anti-Semitism consensus statement. And before I share with you what it is, we're going to do a little consensus building exercise. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you, is this anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic? I'm going to show you 3 political cartoons, and I'm going to ask you for your personal opinions. Some of you are in groups. I know this will be more challenging for you, but we also will ask for volunteers to come off mute and explain their position, one from each side. So we'll do a pro and a con. Okay, ready? One second. Okay, can everyone see that? Rabbi, can you see that?
I can.
Okay, great.
Yes.
So what I'd like you to do is process what you're looking at. Take 15 seconds. And then I'm going to ask you, is this anti-Semitic or is not anti-Semitic? Specifically, it could be uncomfortable. It could
Put it
be,
on projection if you could. It's hard for us to see it.
how's that?
Okay.
Okay.
Totally.
So you may find it uncomfortable. You may find it to be free speech you disagree with, or is it anti-Semitic? So I know I'm asking you for a binary here, and it may be more complex than that, but I'd like to ask you if you think it is or if it's not. So can I get a volunteer, and Rabbi, since I'm sharing screen, I might ask on you to call on someone to explain why they think that this is an anti-Semitic cartoon.
Okay, I'm looking at our screen. Give me somebody, raise a hand if you feel it's anti-Semitic.
I don't see the hand raise button, Rabbi, but we'll comment if you want. It's Dan.
Sure, so I see, Dan,
I'll raise it.
go ahead, and then I'm going to give it to Bob.
Okay, I'm happy to yield it to Bob if you want.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so it's anti-Semitic. It's equating, I presume, the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza with kneeling on George Floyd's neck. And it's anti-Semitic because those are absolutely not parallel events. The circumstances are altogether different, and many would not see the Israeli occupation as being armed and leaning on the necks of the Palestinians as depicted.
Thanks. Is there
I,
any?
by the way, absolutely agree. Go ahead, Bob.
I don't have that much to add. I mean, it's on multiple levels, multiple tropes, making Israel an apartheid oppressor, just like what happened to what is happening to Black people in America, being shot and killed. It's just making the equivalence of the two and saying that, well, if you're for Black Lives Matter, then you have to also be against Israel, and it's implied against Jewish people, although it doesn't explicitly make it all Jewish people, but still that it goes so deeply into that trope that it feels to me like very anti-Semitic.
Thanks. Is there anyone that would like to share a con that they feel this is not anti-Semitic? And again, this is just an exercise. This is not on the record.
This mouse thing.
Anybody
I'm
have
sorry.
a-
I'm sorry, I totally screwed that up. Your mouse is weird. I'm sorry, this mouse is weird.
I'm sorry. Hey,
So-
Kate, I need a little help with
Um,
noise.
Yes, give me just a second. Yes, how can I help you?
There's some noise coming from somewhere.
Oh, okay, yeah, give me just a second. Let me just kind of see what's going on here.
By the way, as Kate's figuring all this out, is there anyone who would want to argue that this is not anti-Semitic?
Rabbi, I would not.
Unmute it. Can you hear me? This is Barbara here. We're having some technical difficulties because I messed things up.
Okay, so
Can you hear me?
issues at the Fisher home, we hear you, yes.
Oh, sorry. So one could argue, and I can hear people making this point, that it's clearly an anti-Israel and a biased against Israel cartoon, but does it cross the line of being Jew hatred? And I would hear somebody say that that is the case, that it's virulently anti-Israel, but not anti-Jew.
Okay.
So we're going to move on. As you can see, there's different perspectives. Can I ask the Fisher household to go on mute? I'm hearing some feedback. Thanks. All right, we're going to do next one. Take a minute, look at it, process it.
Alan Fisher's request is blocking part of the display here anyway. I don't know, Rabbi, if you can fix it. There's no translation to be enabled. I don't know where that gets done.
So can I ask someone who thinks that does anyone think that this is anti-Semitic that would like to weigh in? Any hands? Okay, let's go with John Levinson. You're on mute, John.
I think it is anti-Semitic because it's showing that Palestinian homes are being demolished in order to build Israeli buildings and Israeli settlements. And I really am very upset with that.
Thanks, John. Is there a someone that feels that this is not anti-Semitic that would like to weigh in?
It's hard for me to just categorically say it's not anti-Semitic, but I can see how it could also be just anti-Israeli. And I disagree with it strongly, but I mean, I don't quite see the full anti-Semitism of this just by itself, but I think people would interpret it in an anti-Semitic way.
Thanks. We're going to do one more just to show that there's different flavors to each of these. I know some of you are looking at a screen, so I'll blow it up as much as I can. Take a moment. There's a few more things to read here, so I'll give you another 10 seconds. All right, this one's lovely, isn't it? Dan and Julie have their hand up.
Yeah, this is atrocious. And I'm old enough to remember the long history from my father and before of the dual loyalty accusations, the anti-Semitic dual loyalty accusations that American Jews are not actually American citizens, they're actually Jews first. And this cartoon, as I read it, is all about the supposed Jewish pro-Israel influence, undue Jewish pro-Israel influence in Washington. And I'd like to hear the counter argument. I'd be interested.
Yeah, I'll just amplify that, Dan. It's about the Jews who control the world with their power.
Yeah, and there's the trope with the bags of money, which is also an anti-Semitic trope.
Oh God, yeah, I hadn't even seen that.
Yep. So
The barbed wire.
exactly. So I wanted to do this a little bit to help demonstrate how we build consensus, why it's important, because there's different levels of nuance or black and whiteness to each of these three political cartoons. And you heard that amongst your own voices, that the third one, boom, anti-Semitic. The first one, probably we have consensus on anti-Semitism, but a couple people raised that there might be a line or two of nuance. And then the second one, I think there might be some disagreement as to whether that's criticism of the Israeli policy or whether that's anti-Israeli or whether that's anti-Semitism. So the reason we need to go through a consensus process is to see where most of our community can come together. So to the extent that we can build one voice around these issues, we're going to be much more effective than if one Jew goes into X congressperson's office and says that, and then the other person goes into the office and says the opposite, right? So the more we can build consensus on the issues of the day, the better. So I want to flag some of the key things that are in this consensus statement that I would encourage each of you to think about as you're engaging in conversations in your own communities, and what we'll get to, which is through those other 4 buckets that I introduced, which we'll talk about at the end. So I'm going to share my screen again. Okay. We talked about that. Okay. So the structure of it, this will be very brief. Background on why we did this now. Obviously, rising anti-Semitism, unprecedented, and we have dueling definitions of anti-Semitism out there. We wanted to build understandings and a framework for describing what it is and how we experience it. And most importantly, how JCRC and the community, through discussions like these, should respond out in the world. So defining anti-Semitism, it's important to know that different Jews experience anti-Semitism differently. If you're a Jew of color, you're going to experience anti-Semitism at the intersection of your experiences with racism. If you're an Orthodox Jew and you are visibly wearing a kippah or a tzitzit, you are going to be on the front lines of anti-Semitism because you are appearing visibly Jewish. I remember when I lived in New York City, I had Orthodox Jewish friends, gay Orthodox friends when I was working at a Wider Bridge, that were afraid to ride the subways with Jewish symbols, right? So we have to recognize that different parts of our community are going to experience anti-Semitism in unique ways, and therefore it makes sense that we're going to have different ways of defining it and describing it. What I want to make clear, though, is that this anti-Semitism consensus thing is not to replace definitions. There's a lot of momentum around IHRA. We're not opposed to that. There's not consensus in the Bay Area with our group that did this, but we're not trying to compete with that definition. Instead, we're giving a framework and a toolkit for understanding how anti-Semitism works. So this is a really important slide, and I apologize for those of you that are a little far away to see it, so I'm going to read some of them. Jews have the right to identify what it means to be Jewish and to define our own anti-Semitism. I would call this the refute to the best friend argument. I have a friend that's Jewish. I couldn't possibly act in an anti-Semitic way. That's the best friend argument. You know, I would say it's more often used in association with the Black community. You know, I have a Black friend. I couldn't possibly be a racist person, right? So we see how this manifests when groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now, you know, some of the token Jews that are in Students for Justice in Palestine, you know, they work with these decision makers. And then when we challenge them on their statements or their positions, they say, oh, I have a Jewish friend. So one common understanding that we need to lift up is that it's on each of us to identify our own oppression, in our case, anti-Semitism, and no one can take that away from us, even if there are other Jews who disagree. They need to listen to our experiences and not tune us out because, oh, I know some other Jew, right? That's an important common understanding. We talked about the second one already, about experiencing anti-Semitism differently. The third one is about conflating Jewish identity with the politics of the conflict. And again, I'd like to compare it to the experiences of other communities in the interest of bridge building. At the beginning of the pandemic, the Asian Pacific Islander community was scapegoated for events that started in China. Whether they were Japanese American or Chinese American, whether they had ever been to China or not, whether they were first generation immigrants or whether they'd been around for centuries, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders were scapegoated with the quote unquote China virus, right? In the same way that Jews last May were being attacked for what was happening in the conflict, regardless of how connected to Israel was, regardless of our political views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We heard from countless parents of high school kids and college students that on TikTok and Instagram on these platforms, that they were being scapegoated and that they were being applied litmus tests to that said, unless you disavow the actions of Israel, you can't join our club. So it's important to relate this conflation to the experiences of other communities, because even though our oppression is unique as Jews, certainly we can connect the dots to the ways in which other immigrant communities or other marginalized communities are experiencing their form of discrimination. The next thing is anti-Semitism has to be taken as seriously as other forms of hate and discrimination. This is something that's repeatedly frustrated us in the case of ethnic studies, right? You Jews don't belong. This is centering communities of color. We don't need the Jewish American experience in here because you're a white privileged religious minority, and therefore you already have Jewish studies in our history classes and in our social studies classes. We don't need you in ethnic studies. That's the argument, right? Now, there are 20 reasons that that statement crosses all the red lines, but the main one that I would say here is you're just not taking anti-Semitism seriously in the same way you are as other forms of oppression. We know how other communities would feel if they were singled out and ignored in such ways. So we need to lift this up. Next, we need to confront those who are unwilling to process anti-Semitism related to the conflict. When we try to relate the fact that anti-Semitism is often weaponizing anti-Israel arguments, people brush it off as, oh, you're just, you Zionists are just trying to remove this conversation. You're trying to deflect criticism from the Israeli government. No, using classic tropes, like you saw in the third political cartoon, criticism of Israel is being weaponized and persuasive due to anti-Semitic tropes that common people understand. All of American society is susceptible to anti-Semitism because we have been conditioned through symbols and tropes and experiences and media for what is considered the Jewish, the Jewish forms of anti-Semitism, right? And so we need to call that out for what it is. It's not controversial. It's anti-Semitism. And lastly, and something that I lifted up a little bit earlier, anti-Semitism is found all across the political spectrum. And of course, it appears most toxic on both extremes, right? You look no farther than Congress with Jewish space laders and All About the Benjamins. We know that it is most toxic on the extremes. However, it's all across the political spectrum. And what frustrates us most, and what we need to talk particularly in our progressive backyard, is that anti-Semitism cannot be used as a wedge, as a political football, to win points, to point blame elsewhere. We need to have the conversation with our friends and partners to say, confronting anti-Semitism starts at home. It starts in our own backyard. It starts having discussions with our partners, because it's not somewhere else. It's not just in Colleyville, Texas, or in Pittsburgh. It's not only these violent incidents, it's casual anti-Semitism that we know can become a tinderbox, and it exists everywhere. So these common understandings are, I think this is the most important slide of the consensus statement, because these really boil down are the frustrations that our community has been sharing and experiencing over the past several years, much longer, of course, but heightened in the past several years, that we really need to break through the surface to have conversations with everyone else about. And that's where JCRC is going with elected officials, et cetera, to tease it. But we need to make sure that we are lifting up these forms of anti-Semitism and the things that are giving us pause from being able to move forward. We have to have this conversation in our own community first and think about how each of these common understandings is or could be affecting each one of us or our community's effectiveness. I think I'll pause there because this is a pretty big slide. Any questions or comments or things that in your own lives that you can relate to that are on your mind with some of these understandings?
Hi, Ty. I'm here at Beth Jacob. Bob Goldberg has a question, and then I'll look online if there are other people who want to raise hand.
Great.
It's more of a comment. I'd like to see a stronger statement here saying that anti-Semitism is a form of racism, because that seems to have gotten completely lost. The discussions around colorism have supposedly eliminated the idea that Jews who look white, which is a racist term, can't be considered a race. Just as, if you look at it more deeply, there is no scientific definition of race. And you take someone like Barack Obama, if it weren't for racism, people would say, oh, he's half white, half black. which is it's racist in itself, but he's half and half of that. But that's not the way racism judges it. Racism says, well, traditionally in the South, that one drop of blood from African American, however many generations back, makes you black. And similarly in Hitler's Germany, it wasn't one drop, but it was one great-grandparent or something like that. So, and these are, and the idea of separating people out by whatever, whether it's the color of their skin or the way their eyes look or the way their other features, or where they came from, that's racism. And I think we have a problem here of people using racist terms and identifying each other by their, quote, race. And it's rampant. You get this, black, brown. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, let me just say the following. This list here is by no means comprehensive. I'll encourage everyone to read the full consensus statement. I don't think we'd be advocating for Jewish inclusion in ethnic studies or discussions around anti-Semitism in ethnic studies if we didn't believe that. That's one of our main motivations. So I just want to acknowledge that, and we'll make sure that we add that into future trainings. It's good feedback for me, so I appreciate it.
Ken here has a question.
Anti-Semitism has been a part of my life, starting when I was young, particularly in sports. And you know, I don't need to go into the whole stories, but it has impacted me personally. But I felt that, like Bob says, that in the community itself, I used to do a lot of work, or still do, in the inner city in Cleveland. And I had a program to help the kids get out of the projects and all that. I ended up in a lot of churches because my partner was a pastor and we were trying to do something in a spiritual way. And now I'm not going to, so I went to the churches. And almost everyone came up to me, many of the churches, and say, you know, there's only one way to go to heaven. And, you know, and to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And I don't think they meant anything bad about it, but it didn't ring well with me. I didn't like it. But I tried to talk to them about what Judaism as best as I could. And particularly to the kids meaning teenagers. They never saw Jews. They never, you know, they only think of maybe the one landlord who has an apartment building that's ripping people off on the rent. You know, slum landlords and stuff like that. So I think the big issue with anti-Semitism, and it may even be so, and I'm not the first to say this, but among Palestinians and Israelis or Jewish people, is the discussion part is to let people know what my religion's about, what your religion is about, and so that we can kind of get away from the stereotypes.
Thanks. Let's take one or two more. Rabbi, I'll let you do.
Mark was out of hand.
Yeah. Hello, Ty. My comment is this principle about conflating Jewish identity is increasingly being conflated with politics. It's very hard for a lot of people who are Jewish and active in American-Israel relations, et cetera, from ourselves not attempting to conflate Jewish identity with politics. It's a way to get Jewish people more involved in politics, and it's a way to get Jewish people, to have more pride in Israel, et cetera. So that one is kind of a double-edged sword, it seems to me.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think something worth grappling with. I would say the main thing that we want to get across is that Jews are facing litmus tests without being asked for their opinion. Not and even if they weren't facing litmus tests, that there is a good Jew and a bad Jew, and that is being presented, I think is highly problematic, and something that no other community would tolerate. So I think that we need to demonstrate how we're being scapegoated and having these litmus tests applied to. This is particularly important for kids in our schools. That is really dangerous, and it really takes away our voice. But
Let's
you're
go
right.
to the Levinson home. John, you're on mute.
Yeah. One of the things that I get very upset with is that somehow when you're talking to a non-Jewish person, or certain non-Jewish people, and they bring up some incident that happened to them that a Jewish person was involved with, somehow they seem to feel that every single Jew represents all the Jews in the world. That if so-and-so gouged somebody on their rent, I should be ashamed of that particular person because he was Jewish, or that I have the connection with him about gouging him on the rent. And I have had that happen to me several times when people told me, they looked at me, they've given an incident to me, and then they look at me for my reaction.
Yep. It's putting the weight of the world on one person, and it's applying all the negative stereotypes to every individual they meet. I think that that's actually a challenge that every marginalized community that I can think of faces, with all the different tropes, different tropes in anti-Semitism, right? There's uniqueness to that. But I would say the same would be true with homophobia that's applied to, gay person that someone meet based on an experience they had with someone else. I would say that is a common experience for marginalized groups like our community that we share with others. And John, a great opportunity to build bridges by relating it to the fact that we experience that just like them. It's a great conversation starter. Okay, moving on. So the statement really breaks down to this, and I'm just going to ask you to do your homework because we don't have time to go through the whole thing. First, it dives into openly and clearly anti-Semitic speech, actions, and beliefs. These are things like the third cartoon that you saw and you knew instantly were anti-Semitism. Classic stereotypes, myths, tropes of powerful and mendacious or subversive Jews, excluding Jews because they are Jewish from something, supporting Nazis, denying the Holocaust, anti-Semitism 101, things that are easily defined. Category 2 is where there's more discussion and where there's more disagreement in our community and where we need some nuance. And I don't only mean nuance in that it's complicated, nuance in that we need to know who we're talking to, who's the audience of this conversation. So through the consensus statement, the group found that political speech that's focused on policies of the government are not necessarily anti-Semitic, but they can cross the line when stereotypes and myths are used and the intent is discriminatory, or only when Jews are not allowed the right to national self-determination. So there's a lot to unpack there, and this statement is a lot longer than that. I just kind of want to lift up because you said, okay, so what is the definition? It's really two parts. And frankly, it's this category 2 where most of the battles that I talked about in the environment are being waged. But it's equally as important that we flesh out these conversations, because that's the main challenge environmentally that we have in our backyard, particularly with the far left, as they try to weaponize the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with these BDS resolutions, these anti-Semitic tropes and things like that. Hold on just a second. Okay. So with that, let's talk about what we're going to do about all these things. But before I do, I want to come back to something that John said and encourage the following. Our community's highest aspiration cannot be stopping anti-Semitism. It cannot be stopping Israel hate or combating BDS. And again, I bring it to the experience of other communities as examples. The Black community isn't just saying stop racism. The gay community isn't just saying stop homophobia or transphobia. They're saying we want criminal justice reform. We want police reform. We want certain types of racial justice. The gay community is saying we want same-sex marriage. We want spousal benefits. We want to make sure that we are treated fairly and equally in the workplace. Our community's message and our highest aspirations can't stop at end the Jewish hate, stop the Jewish hate. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. I would challenge that our community's highest aspiration is to be celebrated and included so that we can bring our full selves to all areas of civic life in the Bay Area and in our country. And when you define it that way, you can get more concrete about what success looks like from our partners, right? If you tell them you want to stop anti-Semitism, great. They absolutely should. But what are the steps required through policy and advocacy and education so that we can achieve that higher positive aspiration? Now, again, I'm almost hesitating to say this because we've had so many problems with their leadership, but Black Lives Matter, never mind some of the saboteurs, the people that are supporting the BDS movement, but the cry of Black Lives Matter, it captured the public's imagination. You had tens of thousands of people marching down the street. By the way, they knew nothing about Israel or that their leadership were on Israel, but they were inspired by this positive message. Same thing with the gay community with love is love. We need a positive message as a community. We can't just stop the way that we're talking about these things as stopping anti-Semitism. So it's really about celebrating Jewish identity, celebrating Israel, and being able to, as individuals, as a congregation, and as a community, be able to bring our full, authentic Jewish selves and everything that that means to us, to our schools, to our governments, to our politics, to our workplaces. That's really what success looks like. And so before moving into this, I would just encourage everyone, we need a positive reframe as a community, because we need to talk about what we're for and not just what we're against, right? We are more than the discrimination that we face. So with that, let's move into the third phase of this, which is tackling these issues, right? So let's start with our own community. And for each of these, I'm going to lift up some of the things JCRC is doing, which we invite you to be a part of, but also things that your congregation and you as individuals can be doing on your own. So in response to the Gaza crisis, we launched Here I Am, which of course is an English translation for Hineni, which you can find throughout the Bible, a resilience campaign, a positive campaign that we belong here in the Bay Area. And so what we did was we started recording for social media stories from Jewish elected officials, from rabbis, from community leaders, community members, Jewish teachers, to tell their stories, their experiences of anti-Semitism, and why they're proud to be Bay Area Jews. And we promoted these online. They're still ongoing, and many of them have gone viral. And so would encourage you in general to tell your stories. B, if you want to become involved with the campaign, we'd love to have you record videos, and we'd be happy to promote and boost paid advertising on our social media channels, your story, your video, because people need to hear what's happening on a personal level. People are moved by stories, as rabbis know well. So the first thing I would encourage you to do is to tell your story. And I just want to share a sample of the Here I Am campaign. You never know how this is going to work over Zoom, but we're going to try it. Give me just a second. All right, can you see that? Can you see Manny?
Yes.
All right, hopefully this works. Is the audio coming through?
Here I am. My name is Manny Gutiel, and I'm an Afghan-American Jew and small business owner in San Francisco. And this is my story about facing anti-Semitism. When there was the most recent fighting in Gaza, there was a rally that was planned, a pro-Palestinian rally, at the corner of 16th and Valencia, right in front of my small business, Manny's. And that day, one of our windows was bashed in, and we had to replace one of the windows. And then not long after that, about 2 weeks after that, We came back to the small business and there was some pretty nasty graffiti that had been written all over the business, including things like Zionist pig, racist pig, free Palestine. When they were protesting, one of the things they chanted was Manny out of the mission. And Manny's out of the mission. So when people are chanting outside of a Jewish business owner that I don't belong here, even though I was born here and this is my state, I think we should be asking the question of where's the line between political discourse and anti-Semitism. I don't want to be the poster child for anti-Semitism. I don't want to be making this video. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to have to talk about this stuff. The weeks of protests were so traumatic for me personally, because I'm a very non-confront, I like to make people happy. I want people to like me, you know? I'm already insecure enough. And then to have people like at my door, like handing out leaflets about how I'm like a white supremacist, like, it was just like, it was unreal, but also like so embarrassing. Imagine the most embarrassed you've ever felt, and then like triple it, and then imagine it happening like clockwork every week. And that's how it felt. I know that what was happening to me was about me, but also was part of a large and long lineage of things that happened to our people. And so I felt like I had to be strong. What I love about the Jewish people is that even though we are from all different ethnicities, backgrounds, and customs, there is a sense of having a global family. And that is exactly the kind of kinship that we need right now. Here I am.
So that was a sample of the Here I Am campaign. And obviously Manny's a pretty prominent community member with Manny's in the Mission. He faced anti-Zionist protests that went on for months. But it underscores both his personal story and a resiliency about who our community is. And so whether you're participating in this campaign, which we'd love to help you set up, or it's just your conversations, storytelling is key. Facts and figures are great, but ultimately it's your own personal experiences with anti-Semitism, wherever you sit in the community, that are going to move someone. And so I would encourage you, just as Manny did, to be vulnerable about these things, because that's the human connection that's going to get the empathy of the community members and leaders that you're talking to. 1 second, back to this. But I also want to lift up that we want to continue building consensus and civil discourse around anti-Semitism, and to continue to do workshops and trainings about both this consensus statement and specific issues within anti-Semitism. So, you're doing this right now with this series, obviously, but we want to continue the education work inside of our community, build capacity, and build a community-wide conversation across the Bay Area about the complexities of 21st century anti-Semitism that our community is experiencing today. The second bucket is government and politics. I'll zoom in. Is that better?
It's good.
Great. So at the bottom, you see actually our Here I Am branded press conferences that we've done in 2 counties, and then we're bringing to the Marin JCC in 2 weeks. So we've gathered elected and civic leaders, along with Jewish community leaders and rabbis. We had 150 people in attendance at Beth Abraham and similar numbers at Emmanuel, to have a press conference to say, here I am, and to hear from Mayor Breed or Mayor Libby Schaff in Oakland. In 2 weeks, it's going to be Jared Huffman and Marin, congressman up there, along with mayors and the police chiefs and rabbis who are all saying in unison across cultures, faiths, and traditions, here I am, to confront anti-Semitism. And Marin, which has a couple communities that have had those terrible leaflets that have been dropped, we're also going to be talking about that. So, one thing I would offer is that this is just the 3rd county that we're doing this in. We would love to work with you and your congregation and the rest of San Mateo County to bring this series to San Mateo County and to have this conversation in your backyard. Our goal is to do this in every county across the Bay Area. And so we'd love sometime between now and the end of the calendar year to be able to set this up and bring our Jewish and civic communities together to say, here I am, united against anti-Semitism and hate. That's a collective level, but the relationship building is key. And this is something I know folks like John Levinson have been doing for decades, which is we need to build relationships with civic and elected leaders, faith leaders, ethnic leaders in our backyard. we can't mobilize and effectively achieve the outcomes that we need unless we have the relationships in advance. So one thing we would love, or one thing you can do on your own, is to think about building a relationship with local elected officials. We know how important Congress is, both when it comes to the US-Israel relationship and in fighting anti-Semitism. This is the farm system, folks. This is where people are getting their chops. This is where people 10 years from now will have deep-seated relationships with the Jewish community before they run for state office, before they run for Congress, before they run for governor. That's the model that's going to be successful. We need to build the relationships early and often. And so we train people at JCRC how to build relationships with civic and elected leaders. And that's another important way that you can get engaged. Another thing that we've looked at, most recently, the city of San Carlos did this, passed a resolution on anti-Semitism. This is just a soft resolution, right? It's non-binding, but it was a way of bringing the conversation to the entire city council of that town, like we did in Menlo Park the week before, like we did it in the city of Berkeley the week after. We're bringing these anti-Semitism resolutions to the consciousness of each of these towns across the Bay Area. And wouldn't it be great if we could get dozens and dozens of these resolutions passed? We're going to be doing a major push for Jewish Heritage Month in May. And it would be great to partner with you to get some of the local towns in our county to be able to pass these resolutions and to have a robust conversation. Again, these workshops and trainings like the one that we just did can be tailored to elected officials, to communities of color, to faith leaders in the Muslim and Christian communities. We need to also make sure that we're getting in front of them and having these conversations on a proactive basis. JCRC is planning to hire a couple of workshop facilitators specializing in different areas to lead these kind of workshops. And we need help getting in front of the right people to make them happen. That's why the relationship building work is so important. Lastly, we're doing a candidate forum that, Rabbi, I know that you just signed on to for the open seat to replace Kevin Mullen. It's so important that we ask questions of candidates running for office and use those as an opportunity to educate them about these issues. So stay tuned on the date in May. It's not on the top of my head, but we'll be doing that for that open seat, as we do for seats across the Bay Area at very different levels of government. I just want to flag, I know this text is small for some of you. This is what success looks like if we're doing our jobs. This is an email that I got from the mayor of Berkeley, Jesse Araguin, who's coming on our Israel trip in May. He's in his late 30s, he's Latino, he's a young and dynamic guy, a rising star in East Bay politics. I'm going to just summarize this. Dear Berkeley Jewish community members, I'm deeply upset at the recent anti-Semitic incident with the hundreds of hateful flyers dropped at the doorsteps of Berkeley Hills. We were one of the several cities targeted over the weekend by this heinous act, which appears to be a national effort. I want you to know that the Berkeley Police Department is actively investigating this incident. I want to make it clear that hate crimes have no place in Berkeley. You have the full support of myself, the city council, and I'm reaching out to express my outrage to see what I can do to support your community. At our council meeting tonight, we'll be voting on an urgency item on the attached resolution, their anti-Semitism resolution. Yesterday, Berkeley Police and the council issued a joint statement, and this afternoon I published an additional statement that builds off yesterday's statement. And then he goes on to talk about the environment that we're living in. I bring this up because we didn't ask him any of that. We did our job educating him as a community. With congregations like Netivot Shalom, he understood all the steps, the police coordination, the public statements, the tweets, the resolution, the outreach to rabbis, to JCRC. He knew how to do all these things because of years of cultivating that relationship. And we're proud to be able to take him in Israel in May, where we'll continue that educational journey. So I just wanted to give you an anecdote on what I think success looks like, because we don't even have to ask if we're doing our job on a proactive basis. It makes our lives a lot easier when those challenging moments come. Okay, next slide. Okay, the next topic is non-government organizations. So I would break this into 3 different categories. Let me just resize this here. One would be ethnic groups, African American, Latino, Pacific Islander, Native American. The second would be faith groups, different ethnicity, different faith communities, Hindus, Christians, Muslims, etc. And the third would be single issue communities like gun control, housing, advocates, people that are working on specific reproductive health advocates. So people in sort of single issue spaces. And of course, we've seen anti-Israel challenges. We've seen anti-Semitic incidents in all three of those buckets and in many sub buckets within those, right? Again, it comes back to the coalition building between a rabbi and a pastor, or a rabbi and an imam, between a community leader on your board and a Black leader of the local NAACP chapter, with local communities putting on something for Pride Week. We need to make sure that we have all of these relationships. The next thing that we can do is coalition building. JCRC has done some extensive work with the Asian Pacific Islander to fight rising hate crimes. We've seen both communities face this model minority myth in which folks in education are not taking the concerns of our students as seriously as we would like because of these tropes that because we are rich or successful or more educated, that our problems don't count. And we've found that our Asian neighbors are experiencing the same frustration that we are. And so we've built bridges with them around that shared frustration, along with the same thing that we talked about earlier, this scapegoated for issues overseas, these litmus tests that are applied to our community. So we've worked on hate crime legislation at the state capitol to make sure that the Justice Department and local police departments are coordinating hate crimes on a more proactive basis. This is an anecdote on what coalition building works like, where we're not working at cross purposes. And I know some of you have expressed concern, not only to me, but to other Jewish organizations that do some social justice work. Aren't you working at cross purposes? Aren't you working with organizations and leaders that oppose our interests when it comes to Israel or anti-Semitism? The answer is we shouldn't be, because there's so much opportunity out there to advance our interests and our neighbors' interests too, as we are with the Jewish Asian conversation in our schools and in fighting rising hate crimes. There's just so much opportunity for us to build constructive bridges that are win-wins for both communities. Again, we want to bring these workshops to other communities. It's a great opportunity to do cross-cultural or interfaith events, which I know that you're all a part of. And lastly, volunteering. Again, I'll use the Asian community as an example since that's my anecdote here. But in Chinatown and Oakland and San Francisco, they have volunteer patrols. And so we're encouraging young people to get involved in these volunteer neighborhood watch type patrols because of these terrible stories coming out about Asian seniors being pushed down on the streets. And they're really looking for citizen support to help them in their difficult moments. That kind of commitment that Jewish community folks can give is a great way to build bridges, do good, and earn other communities' trust. A couple more slides and then we're going to open it up for conversation, thoughts, things like that. I'm almost done. The next, of course, is public education. We've been fighting this ethnic studies battle for almost 3 years now. And the reality is it's gotten a lot messier now that it's left the state, because there are 1,000 public high school districts across the state of California. Now, let me explain it this way. I'm going to unshare. There are 5 layers to this ethnic studies fight. There's the state fight, there's the county fight, there's the school district fight, there's the school fight, and then there's the individual teacher. And the reality is we have to be engaged in building relationships and advocating at every one of those rungs of the ladder if we want to continue to succeed at this fight. Let me add one other way of thinking about this. California is a very diverse state. In red parts of California, Kevin McCarthy's California, they're going to fight tooth and nail even having to implement ethnic studies now that it's a mandate. Whereas in communities like Berkeley or Oakland, we have a hugely uphill battle, or Castro Valley for that matter. But the reality is most of the districts are somewhere in between. There's going to be a handful of school districts like the superintendent of Castro Valley that are a true believer in liberated ethnic studies in which Jews don't belong, in which we're going to have to, play real hardball and potentially bring out tools that we want to use as last resorts, like legal tools. But for the most part, think about what position school board members and superintendents are in right now. They've got enough nightmares on their hands. They've got the pandemic, and they've got reopenings, and they've got budget shortfalls, and they've got teachers threatening to resign at the end of the year because they're so burned out. Most school districts don't want another fireworks on their hands. And so if we can meet with each of these school districts, district by district, there's 100 in our Bay Area and there's 1,000 across the state, build relationships with superintendents, school boards, principals, teachers in our networks. We can divert 90% of this. You heard me right. The 10% is getting a lot of attention, but the reality is most school districts, A, want to do the right thing and do this without controversy. They don't want more controversy. And if you look a little bit north from where you're living, look at the school board recall in San Francisco. Our strategy now is to tie liberated ethnic studies in this anti-Israel, anti-Semitic movement of ethnic studies to the circus that got 3 members of the San Francisco School Board recalled from anywhere between 72 to 79%. Okay, that's not just Republicans recalling those school board members. That's a mandate if I've ever seen one. And so we're non-political. We're not going to go there as JCRC, but you certainly can go political if you want with these school board races. But more importantly, it shows how disconnected liberated ethnic studies is, just like these school board members are, from the concerns of real parents and real students in their districts. That's not what they care about. And so we want to conflate the two and show what a circus liberated ethnic studies really is. And so that's really where we would encourage you to take that conversation. So we need help for those of you connected with school districts, for those of you that have kids or grandkids in public schools in San Mateo County. We need to understand where those inroads are. We need to meet proactively with those school districts to make sure that we can educate them about our community's concerns and lift up a version of the curriculum that is going to be acceptable to our community, that has a robust conversation around anti-Semitism, that includes the Jewish American experience and excludes some of the negative tropes about the conflict in Jews that we've seen in some of the radical school districts like Castro Valley. Last slide, and then we'll open it up. Corporations. We've seen a remarkable push for diversity, equity, and inclusion in corporate spaces. Now, to be clear, DEI work is happening everywhere, but I think that this is the real challenge and opportunity that we face, in that diversity officers of major corporations, particularly in Silicon Valley, apologize if anyone's connected to Google. I just found a stock image. I'm not trying to pick on Google, but the reality is Jews are very infrequently included in the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts or diversity efforts of many of these major corporations, leaving Jews out of the conversation and leaving out conversations for human resource departments, what it means to protect and make sure that Jewish employees feel celebrated and feel safe in their workplace and not discriminated against or not being challenged every day about how they feel about the conflict or about the state of Israel. So we need to make sure that Jews are included in this DEI conversation. So again, we have to make sure that wherever we have inroads to many of these corporations, that we're asking them, that we give Jews toolkits and trainings to ask their employers, if you're doing DEI work, are you including the Jewish community? We have challenges that we want you to hear about, and this is what I need as a Jewish employee from my HR department or my DEI initiatives. The reality is this is incredibly complicated. And another thing that I would recommend for each of you is to do your own DEI training. Now, we probably have different opinions about DEI, what it means, what the concepts are. But if you want to understand the space, if you want to understand how Jews are being weaponized against in this space, you better learn about the space, whether you like it or not. So this is not an endorsement necessarily, although I certainly think that much of it is valid and should be considered. I'm also asking you on an intellectual basis to learn about DEI efforts because of how they are manifesting against us. We need to understand the intricacies as a community, understand how we can build Jewish identity into the fabric of it, and also what the risks and threats are. And the last thing I'll say on this is we see a number of corporations doing work for Women's Month, for Black History Month, for Pride Month. How many major corporations are doing some kind of public-facing initiative or philanthropic work for Jewish Heritage Month or for their Jewish employees? So I think this is another area that we need to work on, which is to make sure that we're being celebrated publicly by corporations that do this for other communities. We seem to be left out in the cold. So I've given you a menu of options in each of these buckets, both for your community and your committee to think about, but also you as individuals, places where you can learn more, places that you can engage more. And as you can tell, this is non-ending. The opportunities and the needs are endless. And so I would encourage you to reflect on where you think you can plug into these efforts, whether it's through my organization or many of the other worthy organizations. It's good that we have many Jewish organizations in this fight, because not all of us can do all, not any one of us can do all of it. But there is a lot of important work, and there's a lot of constructive work that we can do together. So with that, I'm happy to take questions, happy to hear your comments and reactions, and happy to have any dialogue that you'd like about this. Over to you.
Okay, let me look and see. Is there anyone who has a question who we haven't heard from yet? Go ahead, Joe.
You know, the ethnic studies is a recommendation, not mandatory. And so you do have to work with the school districts that don't want to adopt the recommendations. So I agree with you that we have to work with the local school boards and every community because it's only a recommendation. It's not mandatory.
So Ty,
So-
can you clarify whether they're mandatory or not?
Two separate things. Ethnic studies is going to be a graduation requirement for the class of 29-30. That's the freshman class of 25-26. So between now and that freshman class, in three school years from now, every public school district across the state is going to need to develop and approve its own curriculum. What you're referring to, Joe, is the model curriculum, which was developed and approved by the state and the school board, but is only a recommendation and not a requirement. And to your point, now we have to fight because the state bureaucracy is so incredibly slow against these liberated ethnic studies providers that are running laps around them like crazy, shopping their radical offerings to school districts, and the state is moving at a snail's pace. So we've been pushing the governor's office and Tony Thurmond at the State Department of Education and working with the Jewish Legislative Caucus to pressure the CDE to be much more aggressive and to make sure that schools know that a valid and approved resource is coming that more closely aligns with the model curriculum.
Ty, is there a sense of where the different districts in each area stand?
It runs the gamut. It runs the gamut both in terms of where they are. Again, I think the biggest population is going to end up following the recommendation of the state. There's going to be radicals like we've seen in Castro Valley that are true believers in liberated ethnic studies. And we're going to see right-wing parts of the state that are going to fight tooth and nail adopting it. The biggest bucket is in the middle and where our community's engagement is going to have the most impact. That's where we're focusing most of our community relations energy. Certainly, there are other tools like politics and legal options for those few bad actor districts where we can have a more aggressive approach, but the relationship building will work in the vast majority of districts.
Okay, let's go to the Fisher home and then Diana, then Ken.
So I wanted to comment that, you showed that picture of Google and it's for good reason, although you downplayed it. I mean, Google hired a person to run their DEI program who had been vehemently anti-Israel in social media postings. And all they did was transfer him to another job. And the universities have done exactly the same thing. The people who want the job of running a DEI program are often people who come in with very strong opinions. Often they're from the more radical side, and universities have had real problems trying to limit that. And corporations as well. And if we don't, it's usually somebody who investigates their background who finds these tweets, and sometimes they're only a few months old, and the statements are often vicious. I think I've seen this at several universities in the last few months. So it's a problem space. You've identified it before, and we've talked about it before, Ty, but it's a big problem.
It's a major problem. And the good news is we have community members that work for, I would guess, pretty much every one of the major tech companies. that can help us speak to the right people and provide those offerings either through us or other organizations that are doing a lot of these DEI trainings. So that's one direct approach. The other track that we're going to take is training DEI providers. Most of them are independent contractors and not employees that do the actual trainings. So we want to actually build inroads with them to help them understand how to include the Jewish American experience in their own offerings around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you. Diana, Ken, and then Dan.
The issue in our schools goes beyond ethnic studies. So I'm a mom of a 7th grader and a 10th grader here in Menlo Park, Hillview Middle School, and Sequoia Union, but it's MA. And every homework assignment, including math classes, everything takes a anti-racist lens where there's always an oppressed oppressor view. And that is how they're teaching our children to think. Not how to critically think, but to think in a one lens view. And so, of course, when you look at it in that lens, Jews are labeled as white supremacists. This is happening today in our schools. I mean, this is why I'm here. And I don't know, because I wrote a letter to the school board, I've sit on the site council. My individual voices are not being heard, or they're just actively being ignored. That's what's happening here in our school district. So what can JCRC offer parents who feel completely dismissed by the schools, the school districts, the superintendents? Because that's my experience, and I know I'm not alone. But the problem is also many people are afraid to speak up, including in the tech. We may have a lot of people in these tech companies, but finding the moral courage when you've got bills to pay and your job is on the line, is a reality, is a sobering reality. So, and I'd like to know what are the protections for people who want to speak up.
I wish I could say that there are protections, but the reality is they're not. I think the best answer I can give you is that there's power in numbers. And to relate it to another movement where that worked was the Me Too movement that took off and had a strong effect. Now we're not here to debate how it went, whether it went too far, whether it was effective or not. But the fact that more and more women were speaking up, and men, by the way, I know plenty of gay men that also face similar situations. The fact that people are speaking up in numbers was what really took down a lot of these behemoths, right? And I think whether we're talking about a school district or whether we're talking about a corporation, what we need to do is start at home to build the courage inside of our own community so that we can build up numbers for these kind of efforts. And where JCRC comes in is organizing these meetings with the backing of the 50 organizations inside of JCRC going in to speak with these superintendents. We always want to use honey before vinegar in things like these. But if the honey doesn't work, you have to demonstrate that you're willing to use vinegar or carrots and sticks if you prefer that. So I'd want to know more about the school district and the particular issue. I'm happy to connect with you offline individually to understand the particulars of this one. Let's strategize. But typically there's power in numbers, and it's a lot harder to face repercussions when it's a loud chorus instead of a lone voice. And I think that's what we need to work on. That's why this resiliency and this pride in our Jewish identities, I think, is also so key to drive people to want to be more vocal and more active and more proactive.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, I just want to take a minute because I know other people want to talk. When I talked about more of a grassroots way over 30 years in the schools, churches, wherever, to try to deflate anti-Semitism. And I got this from my father, who was in charge of the ADL in Ohio, and also was a Navy veteran, Jewish, on a ship, and he was the only Jew on a ship, and he was treated horribly, anti-Semitically, even though he was a captain. And what I'm trying to bring up is, I try to keep my story short, but I didn't hear a response from you. And that bothered me. Not because I'm sensitive, because I just didn't know if this is part of your plan to reach out into the community. So I want other people to talk.
Let me ask for clarification, because I think that's our entire plan, which is relationship building with other communities and getting Jews involved up and down the Bay Area in that effort. That's one of the reasons that I think I'm speaking with you today. So can you clarify a little bit as to where you think the gap is that I haven't addressed?
Yeah, I think he took your thing as a, of course, when you said it.
What's that?
I think he took your comment as, of course, that's what we do, and you were affirming what he was saying. So I think we might have the disconnect.
I understand
no one
that,
has heard.
but I didn't get any feedback.
Gotcha. I think
Okay.
the feedback is amen, yes.
Yeah, but it came in after I asked. So,
Gotcha. Okay.
On my feet, applauding and absolutely. How's that?
Good. Thank you. Dan, Julie, and then to the Fisher home, and then to John. It's an
Great, hi,
important
I'll keep this
conversation.
brief. Tyler, thank you very much for tonight. This has been extraordinarily unsettling, but I think that's important, and I hope the snow in Mammoth is good. The question I had, and it may be a little too specific for this, when our kids were still school age, the Menlo Church had a huge and disproportionate impact in our local school district, which was actually ours was, well, Sequoia Union for high school and then Las Lomitas for elementary and middle. Do they still, and what is the Jewish community's relationship with them? Because we've kind of lost track of that. I don't know. I know they used to be Presbyterian, they're not anymore. I don't know where they're coming from on all of this. And if that, again, if that's too specific, you can go on to another question, but I'm curious to know if we've had any interactions, if you had any interactions with them.
I'll be honest on this one. I'll need to consult my predecessor, Doug Kahn. If you'll email me, or if the rabbi can just please share my email, I'm happy to look into this one for you and get back to you as soon as I can. I'll admit that I'm out of the loop on that one since it happened before my time.
Fair enough, no worries. Nat, you may know something about it too. So
I actually do. So, I've been here for a long time now. We're talking year 27. And when I first got here, there was this whole thing where the parents of the kids at Woodside High says, there's a group of kids who are pulling all the Jewish kids to do Let's Pray at the flagpole. And, they were doing this whole missionizing thing, and it came from that church. And so I went and I spoke to the pastor, and he says, well, Rabbi, that's what we do. And I said, that's a really, really bad answer. So subsequently, this church has gone through interesting iterations and interesting histories. They are much more internally focused right now because they had a whole scandal with their senior pastor. So they've turned internal. I've got dear friends who are connected to that church, and those efforts for the current time being are very dormant. So it's kind of each church in its own history. Are there other places that I'm worried about in terms of the influence that they're trying to bring? I am. Menlo Church is not one of them right now.
great, thanks.
Sure. Let's go to the Fisher home and then to John.
Hi, thank you. Ty, I really admire your strength and your energy to take this on. One thing that I've noticed has been at Stanford, and I'm wondering, are you going to be taking on the universities that are making DEI a necessary part of almost every department? And they started a clinic, a DEI clinic in my department, and I tried to fight it really hard, and I used things like rational common sense and reason, and I was totally thwarted by the Jewish director of the service, who absolutely didn't know what I was talking about. So I'm really concerned because I think, in my department, like if supposing you're African American and you have an illness, you can elect to go to the African American part of the department. So they recognize your ethnicity rather than your illness. And I thought, a white supremacist couldn't ask for a better outcome. But I got nowhere. And I'm wondering, I guess it's the long story. I'm wondering if you're tackling on the universities.
Yes, and I believe that we were involved with that issue as well. And we met with the Stanford administration about that. One of my board members now is the director of DEI for the San Francisco 49ers, an African-American Jewish woman who's amazing. So the two of us met with some of the leadership at Stanford about this issue. The DEI efforts are across all 5 of the buckets, to be clear. This is a national call for racial reckoning, if you will. And so we're looking at it everywhere. We're also looking at it with K-12 schools, as well as elected office holders, looking at public employees for cities even. This is happening everywhere. So this is systemic. And that's one reason we want to go straight to the DEI providers instead of chasing every single place where DEI is happening. We think it'll be a more efficient approach, even if it's not going to work entirely. We're still going to have to put out fires, but that I think is going to be the most strategic way for us to do this quickly and effectively. But yes, it will include higher education, and we're looking at Stanford and we're looking at San Francisco State. Surprisingly less at Cal. Cal's been the quieter campus for the past couple of years, which surprised me as much as it might surprise some of you. But Stanford and San Francisco State in particular have been quite challenging lately. John? You're on mute.
John, we still can't hear you.
Okay, here I am. One of the things I want to reiterate that Ty has really touched on, the whole secret here is getting involved. Getting involved, very importantly. You know, a lot of people pay no attention to school board elections or city council elections or board of supervisor elections, so they don't think they're important. Let me tell you, we are more affected by the laws that come out of school boards, city councils, and the board of supervisors than we are about that come out of Washington or out of Sacramento. These people take actions that directly affect our lives. And it's easy to get involved with somebody who's running for school board. So when the issues come up, you can go and talk to them because they're beholden to you, because you've worked on their campaign. You've helped them to get elected. You've made sure their policies. You can have a coffee at your house for them. You can make sure that you get to know them and they know your name so that when you call, they know who they're talking to. This is very, very important. I've always felt that a lot of people neglect the necessary support for these the elections for these particular offices because they don't think they're that important. But now we're seeing how important they are. Imagine that you can talk to a school board member and say, look, you know, we're having a real problem here and we'd like you to get involved. And in most cases, they haven't heard about it. And you're the one to tell them, and they know you and they respect you. That's just what I wanted to add. Thanks, Ty. You've done a terrific job tonight.
Thanks, John. Always good to see you. I can't beat that. So let me just share something else. Because you said it perfectly, which is we have an added responsibility here in the Bay Area because what starts in the Bay Area sweeps the country. Ethnic studies is now having been adopted or is being considered in 18 states across America. And so now we are training our colleagues everywhere from Massachusetts to Illinois to Washington, D.C. on how to set up this fight and how to learn from some of the mistakes that we made along the way. And so our ability to handle these issues effectively here quite often are going to serve a model for the country because many good ideas and bad ideas start in the Bay Area. And so that's also why it's so important that we get involved, is we have that added responsibility so often.
Wow. I'm both inspired and a little overwhelmed. I actually think that the work that we need to be doing now, we need to be strategic and smart as well as a shul. One of the things, one of the kind of hopes that I had in mind as we put these together is, I appreciate all the people at the Fisher Summer Home. Was it in smaller groups? We talk about what we're going to do. Too often, by the way, people will say what they think others should do as opposed to what they will do. And one of the outcomes I'd like to see of this series is people saying what they will do
and me trying to help stitch people together. I'll kind of conclude with that and then some thanks, but I see that there are two more things. One is Kate wanted to ask a question, and the other is that there's another question at the Fisher Summer Home.
Hi, I just had a question. You know, I've seen it a lot that like we're always concerned, you know, with supporting other causes, and we're always talking about, oh, how can we support this one, and how can we support that community, and how can we help out these folks? And I was curious kind of if you had any thoughts about like, is there a way for that to kind of work in reverse where like we can, you know, get those other communities that we're always stepping out for, and we're always, you know, why can't we just talk about us, or why can't we get the same thing in response? And I'm just kind of curious if you had any thoughts on that.
I think that that touches on one of the things we talked about earlier, which is anti-Semitism deserves to be treated with the same degree of concern as other forms of discrimination. And I think you've just named anecdotally that it's not, right?
Yeah.
So I would just say two things about coalition building, one of which I already spoke about. One is that we should not work at cross purposes, right? We should not partner with other groups that are undermining some of our community's goals.
Mm-hmm.
And two is that we can create win-wins and strengthen coalitions.
Mm-hmm.
So I lifted up the API partnership around hate
Mm-hmm.
crimes and the rising hate that both of our communities are experiencing right now. There's a way to do this where we don't have to have a trade-off between
Mm-hmm.
us helping them or them helping up. I believe that that's the most effective model and the one with the strongest reinforcement effect for friendship, because it's happening in real time. And there are ways that we can do that with Black churches, with African American communities, with the LGBT community. By the way, trans communities are in crisis right now because of some of the laws being passed elsewhere. We have a lot of trans Jews that are calling on us to do more about that. So there are many ways that we can create win-wins here without working across purposes and without having this one-way street that you've named that causes us so much frustration.
Mm-hmm.
And Ty, I would add to that here at Beth Jacob, we have this wonderful relationship with a multiracial church that meets here. It's a large church with a very charismatic pastor who, whenever we need anything, is there for us. And they reach out to us. And so it really drives home the message of how coalition and partnership and friendship and relationship does make it a dynamic where it works both ways. I think we need to be building on that in many ways. Last question at the Fisher Summer Home.
Hi, hopefully you guys can hear me. So I was wondering, I'm in education space. I'm also an alum of 13 years of San Francisco Public Schools. So I don't know if you guys are able to hear me.
We can hear you. We're good.
Okay. So because of that, I've been following the recall effort really closely. I've also had a lot of experience, both as a teacher and also as a student, of seeing these kind of both local level and state level kind of those casual anti-Semitism and also the systemic anti-Semitism efforts. And one thing I was wondering about when I saw the talk about guardrails and everything else, I understand that there's a talk about getting the state to move faster from the Department of Education end. But I'm also wondering, I don't know a lot about this, what is the process from the point of view of the California Department of Justice as far as, you know, hate crimes against Jews in schools, around incitement against Jews in schools, and what recourse do we have through that to make sure that even districts that won't cooperate, because I guarantee you San Francisco, even with a new board, probably will not cooperate on this. How can we protect the Jewish students who are still in the district and also protect, quite frankly, the people who are going to be coming across students who have taken San Francisco ethnic studies and are going to be in our universities in a couple of years?
Great question. And you seem like someone that should be advising me. So I'd love to get in touch with you. Look, I think, number one, we've been encouraged by what we've seen from the new Attorney General, Rob Bonta. He's created a racial justice task force. And we initially thought to ourselves, here we go again. But he reached out to us right away and said, we want Jews around the table. And so some of the questions that you've raised, we've brought to his attention, and we've started building some great relationships with his staff. And they're taking our concerns seriously. both around everything from Colleyville to the leaflets to this ethnic studies issue to other concerns in schools. We're bringing these issues to their attention, and they are aware of some of the challenges in our schools. The other thing I would say is we can't stop there. We need independent efforts from our community when legal fights are necessary. And I want to remind everybody, this is an effort of last resort. We do not want our community to be perceived as overly litigious, right? But if push comes to shove and our community is being discriminated against, we have to stand up for ourselves, and we will.
Great. Thank you so very, very much, Ty. It was a really powerful and important night. To everyone online, be in touch. Thank you to John Levinson, Alan Fisher, and Diana Bloom, who's here, who really have put this series together. Come next week as we talk more about the ethnic studies curricula with Alina Kaplan of ACES. And we'll get to work. There's a lot of work to do.
Thanks so much for having me, Rabbi. Thanks, everyone.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Give me names.